The day my grandfather was buried, my cousin handed me a trash bag and told me I had 48 hours to clear out of the house I'd lived in my entire life. I stood in the driveway with the bag hanging from my fist, still wearing the tie I'd put on for the funeral, and I watched him walk back inside and close the door without looking at me once. The porch light clicked off. Just like that. My grandfather had built Dunmore Feed and Supply from nothing. 40 years of 6 a.m. mornings, handshake deals, and a reputation in Clarksville, Tennessee that meant something. When he died, everyone expected the business to pass to me. I was the one who'd worked summers in the warehouse since I was 14. I was the one who drove him to chemo appointments and sat in that waiting room reading old Field and Stream magazines for 3 hours every Thursday. I was the one he called his boy. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my grandfather had changed his will 8 months before he died, or so my cousin claimed. The reading happened in a conference room at a law firm downtown, all dark wood paneling and framed diplomas. My grandfather's attorney, a man I'd never met named Garrett, read from a document that left everything, the business, the property, the accounts, to my cousin and his father, my grandfather's surviving son, my uncle. I sat there and listened to my future disappear one paragraph at a time. I kept waiting for someone to say something, for my uncle to shift in his chair and look at least a little uncomfortable. He didn't. He sat with his hands folded on the table like he was waiting for a bus. Afterward, in the parking lot, I pulled Garrett aside and asked to see the original document. He said it was all properly filed and notarized. When I asked why my grandfather had never mentioned this change to me, not once, in all those Thursday drives, Garrett just looked at me with this practiced expression of sympathy and said, "Grief makes us want things to be different than they are." I was 23 years old. I had $600 in my checking account, a 2009 Ford Ranger with a cracked windshield, and a trash bag full of clothes. I drove to my friend Mac's place and slept on his couch for 2 weeks, staring at the water stain on his ceiling at night, trying to figure out what my grandfather had actually intended. Something felt wrong. Not wrong like I was in denial, wrong like a smell you can't place, something off underneath everything else. My grandfather was meticulous. He kept paper copies of everything. He mailed birthday cards 6 days early so they'd arrive on time. He wrote his grocery list in the same order as the store layout so he'd never have to backtrack. A man like that doesn't make major legal changes without telling the one person he called every Sunday morning without fail. Me. I'd gone through what little I had from the house. A shoebox of photos, a pocket knife he gave me when I turned 16, some of his fishing gear. At the bottom of one of the tackle bags, stuffed inside a wool sock, I found a key. It was a standard house key, the kind you'd cut at a hardware store. Old brass, worn smooth on the edges. On the paper tag looped through the hole at the top, in my grandfather's handwriting, small, careful print, the way he always wrote, were 2 words: Harlan, Cedar. I sat on Mac's bathroom floor and held that key for a long time. My grandfather had a brother named Harlan who died in 1987. I knew almost nothing about him. My grandfather rarely talked about that side of the family, and when he did, it was in the past tense, in the way people speak about things they've made peace with and closed off. What I knew was that Harlan had owned some land in eastern Kentucky, near the Virginia border, coal country, and that after he died, the land had just sat there. I typed Harlan Dunmore property, Eastern Kentucky, into my phone. It took me 3 hours of searching county tax records online before I found it, a parcel of 4.2 acres in Letcher County, Kentucky. The registered owner was listed as the estate of Harlan J. Dunmore. Property taxes had been paid continuously for 37 years, most recently 6 months ago. My grandfather had been paying taxes on his dead brother's land for nearly 4 decades, and he'd never mentioned it to anyone. I told Mac I needed to borrow his phone charger and take a drive. He looked at me for a second and then nodded and didn't ask any questions, which is why he's been my best friend since 5th grade. The drive to Letcher County took just under 5 hours. I left at 5 in the morning when the interstate was empty and the sky was still dark blue, The kind of dark that makes everything feel like it exists outside of normal time. I had half a tank of gas, a gas station coffee, and my grandfather's key on the seat beside me like a passenger. The county roads in eastern Kentucky don't follow logic. They follow the mountains, which means you're turning constantly, climbing and dropping, losing your GPS signal every few miles. I pulled over twice to double-check the address against the screenshot I'd taken of the tax record. The trees were bare. It was late February, and the ridgelines looked like scratched pencil lines against a gray sky. I almost missed the turnoff. It was gravel lane, almost completely overgrown. Just a gap in the brush line you'd never notice if you weren't looking for it. I eased the truck down the lane for about a quarter mile, branches scraping the sides, and then I came around a curve and stopped. There was a house, a small A-frame cabin, maybe 800 square feet, sitting in a cleared space that had almost completely reclaimed itself. Cedars everywhere, big ones, 15 or 20 feet tall, planted in rows that you could still make out even though they'd long since grown past any original shape. The cabin's siding was weathered to the color of old bone, the porch steps were rotted through in the middle, and one of the front windows was boarded over with plywood. But the roof looked solid, and the door was still on its hinges. I sat in the truck for a few minutes. Cedar. The key tag. I was looking at the reason for that word. I got out and picked my way across the overgrown yard, stepping around a rusted wheelbarrow and what was left of a split-rail fence. The porch groaned under my weight, but held. I fit the key into the lock, and it turned like it had been oiled last week. The inside was cold and smelled like cedar and old dust and something else beneath that, paper maybe. Old paper. There was a wood stove in the corner, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a built-in bookcase along one wall with nothing on it. The floor was rough-cut hardwood that had dried and shrunk over the years, gaps between the boards you could see through in places. The cabin was a single room downstairs, with a steep staircase leading up to a loft. I climbed it carefully, testing each step. The loft was the full footprint of the upstairs, low ceiling, cedar planks, a single small window at each end, and along the back wall, tucked under the lowest point of the roof, where the ceiling sloped down to about 4 feet, there was a wooden chest. Heavy, dark wood, maybe 3 feet long, with a simple latch. No lock. I crossed the loft on my knees because the ceiling wouldn't let me stand, and I opened it. Inside, a metal lockbox, the kind sold at hardware stores for document storage. A bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. A cassette tape in a clear plastic case, the label on the spine written in my grandfather's hand, and underneath all of it, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, a VHS camcorder from the early 90s. I sat back on my heels and just looked at it all. My hands were shaking a little, which surprised me. I'm not someone who shakes. I'd kept it together through the funeral, through the will reading, through 2 weeks on Mac's couch. But sitting in that loft with my grandfather's handwriting on a cassette tape, something cracked open in my chest. The lockbox opened with a 3-digit combination, my grandfather's birthday, which I tried on instinct, 417, and it clicked on the first try. Inside. Documents. A lot of them. The first thing I saw was a letter from a notary public dated 14 months ago, then a copy of a handwritten will, and then a document that took me several minutes to fully understand, a detailed account, in my grandfather's careful small print, of a conversation he'd had with a man named Pruett. Pruett was a business attorney, my uncle's business attorney. According to my grandfather's account, Pruett had come to him 8 months before he died and told him that certain estate complications could be avoided if the will was restructured. My grandfather had written down Pruett's exact words, with dates and times and the location of each conversation. He'd been documenting everything. Because he'd suspected, even then, that something wasn't right. There was a second document underneath the first. A toxicology notation from a private physician my grandfather had seen on his own, not through his regular doctor's office. He'd had his own blood work run. He'd been concerned about certain symptoms, fatigue, confusion, tremors, that had appeared suddenly and didn't match his oncology profile. I read that page 3 times before I let myself understand what it meant. My grandfather hadn't just suspected financial manipulation, he'd suspected something worse. I took everything out of the lockbox and laid it carefully on the flannel shirt on the floor in front of me. I didn't rush. I read every page. The letters in the bundle were from Harlan, my grandfather's brother, and they went back to the 1980s, talking about this property, talking about family, and in the last few letters, talking about a conflict with my grandfather's uncle over land rights that had been resolved, finally in Harlan's favor and then passed to my grandfather's keeping. My grandfather had been the one Harlan trusted. Even then, the cassette tape. I didn't have a way to play it in the cabin, but the camcorder had a built-in screen, one of those flip-out LCDs, and I found, after 15 minutes of figuring out the ancient mechanism, that the tape was already loaded inside the camera. I sat in that loft with the camcorder on my knee and pressed play. My grandfather's face filled the small screen. He looked older than I remembered him, looking even at the end, but his voice was steady. He'd set the camera on something at about chest height, sitting in what I recognized as his kitchen. The old wallpaper with the blue checks was visible behind him. The timestamp in the corner read 11 months ago. He said, "If you're watching this, you found the key, which means you went looking. That's my boy." He paused, looked down at his hands for a moment. "I don't have a lot of time to say this, so I'm going to say it plain. What Garrett showed you at the reading is not what I wrote. What your uncle and Pruitt put in front of me last spring was not what I agreed to, and I signed it. I'll be honest with you. I signed it because they had things on me. Old things. Business decisions I made 30 years ago that weren't all on the right side of the line. Pruitt knows those things. Your uncle knows them. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd go public and take everything anyway, and you'd be left with nothing either way, and my name would be destroyed besides." He cleared his throat. "But I found something out after I signed it. I found out what they'd been doing to the inventory accounts. And I found out about a conversation your uncle had with a man who works at the county assessor's office about reclassifying the business property so the tax basis changes the moment I'm gone. That's fraud. Federal tax fraud. And I put every piece of paper I have about it in that box." He looked directly into the camera. "I also put in the real will, the one I wrote myself at home with a notary who is not Garrett. Her name is Ms. Reyes. Wait, that's in your list, isn't it?" He shook his head slightly. "The notary's name is in the documents. She can verify everything. What I want is for you to take all of this to a lawyer. Not a local one. Someone from outside the county. Someone who doesn't know your uncle's name." He stopped. His jaw tightened in a way I recognized. The way he looked when he was deciding whether to say something he'd been holding back. "I love you," he said. "I should have told you about this place a long time ago. I should have told you a lot of things. But I thought I had more time to do it right." The recording ended. I sat in the dark loft for a while. The light through the cedar plank walls had shifted while I'd been reading and watching. It was afternoon now, the gray winter light going thin and flat. Then I heard tires on gravel. I went still. A vehicle was coming down the lane. I heard it stop, heard a door, then two doors. Voices. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was purposeful. Not lost, not confused. Someone who knew where they were going. I moved to the small window at the back of the loft and looked out through the dirty glass. A dark-colored pickup was parked behind my truck, blocking it in. Two men were walking toward the cabin. One of them I didn't recognize. The other one was my uncle's oldest friend, a man called Breck, who'd been around my family my entire life, who I'd always assumed was just a good old boy who liked to hunt and fish. He was holding a bolt cutter. I don't know what they expected to find in the cabin. Maybe nothing. Maybe they thought it was a bluff, that my grandfather had never actually come out here and there was nothing to recover. Maybe they just wanted to make sure. But they hadn't come out here to talk. I got the documents back into the lockbox. I got the lockbox into my jacket. I put the letters and the tape and the camcorder into the tackle bag I'd brought up from the truck. I'd grabbed it from the back seat out of habit when I parked. I did all of this quietly and fast, and without letting myself think about what I was doing, which is the only way I know how to move when things are going sideways. The loft staircase was at the front of the cabin, which was the wrong direction. But there was a window at the back of the loft, a small one, about 18 inches square. I looked at it. I looked at the tickle bag. It fit. I fit. I came out the back window onto the sloped roof of a small addition, a lean-to, just a few feet off the ground. I dropped into the yard behind the cabin into knee-high dead grass and kept low, moving along the tree line. I could hear them inside the cabin now, moving around, opening things. I made it to the gravel lane on the far side of the property. There was an older track through the cedars, nearly invisible, that must have been the original access road before the lane was cut. I followed it on foot through the trees for about 10 minutes until I came out on the county road about a quarter-mile from the turnoff. I walked to a gas station. I called Mac. "I need you to drive to Kentucky," I said. 3 seconds of silence. "Are you okay?" "Not yet," I said, "but I will be." The attorney's name was Lyndon Marsh. He was based in Lexington, Kentucky, had no connection to Clarksville, and had spent 11 years as a federal prosecutor before going into private practice. I found him through a referral from a professor at the University of Tennessee Law School who owed Mac's mother a favor. Within 48 hours of my sitting in Marsh's office and laying the contents of the lockbox on his conference table, he had called a contact at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. What unfolded over the next 4 months was slow and then fast, the way these things go. The notary my grandfather named, a woman named Dolores who ran a small tax prep and notary business in a strip mall outside of Clarksville, confirmed that she had notarized a handwritten will for my grandfather 13 months before he died. She'd kept her own copy, per her standard practice. The document was dated and witnessed. My grandfather had been of sound mind and had come to her alone. The will that Garrett had presented at the reading was real, in the sense that it had been properly notarized and filed. But it was signed under duress, and the financial records that my grandfather had documented in the lockbox showed a pattern of manipulation going back almost 2 years. Pruitt had been systematically restructuring the business accounts in ways that benefited my uncle, reclassifying assets, underreporting inventory values. The county assessor contact turned out to be a clerk named Tilson who'd accepted to alter records. My uncle's attorney, when interviewed, initially denied everything. Then the IRS pulled the business accounts and the picture became impossible to deny. My uncle called me 3 months after the investigation opened. I was sitting in Mac's kitchen eating cereal, which felt like an absurd place to be when your uncle calls to tell you he's cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He said he was sorry. He said he'd made choices he couldn't undo. He didn't ask me to forgive him, which was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in 2 years. Breck and Pruitt didn't cooperate. They took it to trial. I was in the courtroom the day the verdict came in. It wasn't dramatic the way you might imagine. There was no outburst, no big moment. The forewoman read the verdict in a flat, factual voice, and Pruitt sat very still, and Breck put his face in his hands. And that was that. Federal fraud charges, conspiracy, and in Pruitt's case, additional charges related to the financial manipulation of an elderly person. My grandfather, who had been experiencing cognitive changes in his last year that Pruitt had taken calculated advantage of. My uncle received a reduced sentence, 18 months, with the option for earlier release based on cooperation. He sold his house to cover legal fees and restitution. I didn't take any satisfaction in watching him go through that. He was my father's brother, and I'd known him my whole life, and there's no version of this where that doesn't hurt. What I focused on instead was the work. Marsh helped me get the original will reinstated. The process took longer than I'd expected, and involved more paperwork than I could have imagined. But Dolores was meticulous and credible, and the court ultimately found that the notarized handwritten will represented my grandfather's authentic intentions, superseding the coerced document. Dunmore Feed and Supply came back to me. I stood in the parking lot on the morning I got the keys, actual keys, the ones that had hung on a hook by the back office door my entire childhood, and I didn't know what to feel. Pride, maybe, but quieter than I'd expected. Something more like grief with a layer of gratitude underneath it. The way those two things sometimes settle together when you've been through enough. The business was in rougher shape than I'd realized. 2 years of mismanagement and asset stripping had drained the accounts and frayed relationships with suppliers. I spent the first 3 months just calling people, vendors, longtime customers, the guys who'd worked the floor for years and didn't know what was going to happen to them. One by one, I told them what had happened. One by one, most of them decided to stay. The assistant manager, a woman named Gail, who'd been with the business for 16 years, looked at me across the desk on my first official day and said, "Your grandfather always said you were the one who'd keep this place honest." I had to look out the window for a second. "I'm going to try," I said. The cabin in Letcher County I kept. I drove back out there in April, when the trees were coming in and the cedars had gone soft and green, and I stood on the porch and looked at what it would take. The roof was solid, which was the main thing. The rest was labor. I spent 4 weekends that spring making it livable again. Mac helped with 2 of them. He's not much of a carpenter, but he's good at keeping you from quitting when something goes wrong, which it always does. We replaced the porch steps, reglazed the windows, patched the worst of the interior. I sanded and refinished the hardwood floor, which turned out to be beautiful underneath the grime. The loft I left mostly as it was. I put a chair up there, and a lamp and a small table. And when I need to think through something hard, that's where I go. I don't know exactly what my grandfather had in mind when he built this place into the plan. Whether he anticipated all of it or just hoped I'd be stubborn enough to find my way through. Probably some of both. He was a man who liked to leave room for things to unfold. But I think about something he said on that tape, and I come back to it a lot. He said he should have told me about this place a long time ago. I used to wonder if he meant the cabin specifically, or something bigger, the whole complicated story of what he'd built and what it cost and what it meant to protect something across generations. I think he meant both. My grandfather's name was Amos Dunmore. He drove a used truck his whole adult life, paid his taxes, called me every Sunday morning, and hid the most important things he owned in a cedar chest in a loft in the Kentucky hills, waiting for the right person to find them. He knew I'd go looking. He knew I wouldn't stop. The feed store opens at 7. I get there at 6:15, like he always did, and I turn the lights on one by one, and I put the coffee on, and I stand in the back doorway for a minute before the day starts and watch the sky go from gray to pale gold over the ridgeline to the east. It's quiet that hour. Everything still feels possible. He would have liked knowing I'd do it that way.